good for insects. Ah, wonderful, somebody's recording it. And yeah, and with that, I will hand you over to Heather.
All right, great, thank you. So yes, today I'm going to be talking about how do we know what's good for insects. And now I'm not myself an insect specialist, but what I am is an animal welfare specialist. And so what I'm going to be kind of covering is how it is that we know what is good for any animal. What is the process that we go through for deciding what's good for them? And how are we going to apply this process to insects? Where are the current gaps? Why is it particularly challenging? Kind of particularly highlighting some of the future research that's needed in this area. So to outline, I'll be talking a bit in the beginning about why insect welfare is important. Why are we talking about this at all? Then I'll talk about assessing insect welfare. And then finally about how we find what the best conditions are for insects. So, this is important because there's basically almost no consideration of insects right now in ethics or in policy. And I think this comes very largely because we have this anthropocentric bias towards animals more like ourselves. I think this is very inbuilt kind of idea, something like a scala naturae, where we've got the sort of lower life forms all the way up to ourselves, right at the top. Insects are very far away from us if we consider a ladder like that. And so they often get less consideration, but something that we're trying to rectify. So why does insect welfare matter? Two things. Firstly, the insects are probably sentient. People have different views on this. I'll go through some of the evidence very briefly. And if you are very interested in this question, our next webinar in October with Lars Chitka will go over a lot of the details about why we should think insects might be sentient. And also because our actions impact a very, very large number of insects, both directly, which is mostly what I'll be talking about today, but also indirectly as well. So when we think about the number of insects that we use, insects as food and feed, the amount of insects that are processed at the moment is in the trillions every single year. So, we're talking about an absolutely massive number of individuals here that are being used in food and in feed for animals. And also, there's set to rise because there are these moves to continue to replace the use of fish meal in aquaculture with more insects as feed. And so given that aquaculture is, again, an emerging industry, if these sorts of insects are being used and their use is increasing, we're going to see those numbers only go up. So it's really important from that point of view that we are impacting a very, very large number of insects, that we want to make sure that we're treating them right. And other impacts, so we've got laboratory research uses insects, much, much lower numbers, but still same sorts of welfare concerns for their housing, husbandry and treatment can apply. And pest control is another area where we can impact a lot of wild insects. And the ideas of what a humane pest control can be really important as well. So when we think about why this matters, why do we care about insects? One of the questions this comes back to is the question of sentience. And like I said, I'll move through this relatively quickly. It's not the focus of this talk, but I think it's important to just get a sense because it builds some of the things that we'll talk about later. So for an animal to be sentient, what this means is it has the capacity to feel. It has these positively and negatively valenced mental states, which are sometimes called affects. And these include pain and pleasure, as it's commonly described, but also a whole range of other things. So hunger, thirst, joy, curiosity, comfort. What's important is that there's all a felt aspect of these. They're not just behavioral programming, they're not just reflex responses within the animal, but there is actually a felt experience common to them, something that we know from our own experience and something that we're now fairly certain quite a large number of other animals have. Sentience is important because we consider it to be morally relevant. So here's a very famous quote from one of the first philosophers who was thinking about this question about how do we decide which animals should be given moral consideration. And he says here, how should we make that line? The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? So we're not trying to think about the rational capacities of animals, but just this capacity for suffering, i.e. sentience. And sentience is also becoming more and more commonly part of the legislation in many countries when they're thinking about how to protect different animals. We should update this because recently the UK also passed legislation that includes animal sentience as part of the considerations for animal protection. So thinking about which animals are sentient does really matter. But this raises the question about how do we know which animals are sentient? The subjective experience of animals isn't directly available for measurement. And for a very long time, this tradition of behaviorism, I'm thinking in the sciences, held that mental states weren't appropriate scientific targets. that science should just stay away from trying to say anything about the mental experiences of animals. We shouldn't be talking about their psychology. We certainly shouldn't be talking about their sentience. I think that has now largely ended. I think there's been a large shift away from this, at least with most of the vertebrates, perhaps with insects a little bit less so, but you can still see a shift in some of the cutting edge science now. And this is because when we think of a naturalist view of what sentience is, the fact that this is something that has evolved, that plays some role for animals, it must have some detectable effects. If it didn't change the physiology or the behavior of the animals, it wouldn't be the case that sentience would have evolved at all. It has to be visible to selection, and if it's visible to selection, it should be visible to us. So then the question is, in what ways is it visible, and how do we figure out which animals are sentient? So here, the best approach is to use multiple lines of evidence. We don't have some single marker at the moment that tells us, yes, this animal is definitely sentient. What we can do is get an evidential picture based on these multiple evidential lines, where the best explanation for everything that we see is sentience. So even though any single one of these lines of evidence may be defeasible, overall, they can raise the probability of sentience quite a lot. And especially if these markers are quite different from each other. So say we have cognitive markers, behavioral markers, physiological markers. So some of these might come from development from humans. So we can do work with humans who can report their conscious experiences to us. It's very helpful. And we can look for the behaviors and cognitive processes and the physiological changes that correlate with when they're conscious versus non-conscious. So if a human, say, sees something on the screen, they see it consciously, they may be able to do things such as certain kinds of learning that they're not able to do if that's perceived subconsciously. And then we can identify also some of the brain regions and processes giving rise to conscious experience to get a better idea of what the neuroanatomy of consciousness is as well. And then we've got the markers developed from evolutionary theory. So like I was saying, we typically think that sentience is something that's evolved because it's good for animals in some way. So when you build a theory about the function of sentience, you can then go on to look for markers. So there's still a lot of debate about what the function of sentience is. This is an emerging research field, but the rough consensus is something that sentience allows organisms to represent complex stimuli and the competing motivations to use for learning and decision-making. And so then what we can do is we can look for features, we can look for capacities that animals have that are related to this function or these functions. So here's a set of example criteria. This is from some work I did with the team at the London School of Economics that was looking at evidence for sentience in cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. But the point was that these were criteria that were developed along the lines of the sort of methods I was just talking about, and to be applicable to invertebrates as well. So they were trying not to be very vertebrate-centric. And so these are criteria here for pain experience. The details of it aren't too important, but you can see here there's some things that are sort of neural criteria, integrative brain regions, their local anesthetics affecting them. There's also behavioral criteria, like the ability to perform motivational trade-offs to balance different threats and rewards, to show self-protective behaviors, to have complex forms of learning, and all these kinds of things build together this evidential picture that I was talking about. So the idea is that there's not one single necessary or specific criterion, but we've got this overall evidential picture, and how strong that is how strong our case is for sentience in the animal. And it's strengthened more if we've got this diverse range of evidence in physiological and behavioral, rather than just coming from one line. Some of the things that might be suggested in this in insects, again, like I said, I'm not going to go into details here because last chapter's talk in October, we'll go into a lot more detail, but insects have what seem to be integrative brain regions in the mushroom body. They're very, very intelligent. At least bees are very widely studied. A lot of this evidence comes from bees because they are so widely studied. But they show complex behavior and cognition. They're easily trained, good learning abilities, all indicative of possible sentience. Cognitive bias testing. This is actually a welfare measure that's used quite often in vertebrates that shows that animals with high welfare or sort of a positive mental state will be optimistic when they're presented with ambiguous stimulus, whereas ones with a negative welfare or negative state will have a pessimistic bias. And the same tests that were performed and are successful for this in a range of vertebrate species also work in invertebrates like bees. And bees show motivational trade-offs, so they can trade off the level of thermal discomfort, so how hot they are sitting on a very uncomfortably hot feeder, versus the quality of the food reward. they receive while on that feeder. So again, this is a little complex trade-off that's related to potentially the evolutionary function of sentience. Pain in insects, this is the big sticking point. So when people talk about insect sentience, what really worries them often is the idea that insects don't feel pain. Skepticism about this comes from sort of some early work that was anecdotal reports, essentially, that, you know, insects after being injured can still carry on normal behaviors. Insects walk around missing their legs, praying mantises will mate whilst being eaten. But there's much more recent work now questioning the background assumptions that go into this, even just questioning the empirical data, because again, it was all anecdotal, it wasn't tested. And so I think that this idea that insects don't feel pain is something also that's probably going to show not to be the case. So I think there's a decent case there for thinking that insects are probably sentient. And even if not certainly, I mean, the evidence is, I guess there's a lot of evidence gaps at the moment, there is evidence lacks, but we should be thinking about a precautionary principle here as well. So if there is some, you know, non-trivial chance that these are sentient animals and that we could be harming them at such large numbers as we saw, that we should be taking their welfare seriously. So the next question is, what does it mean to take their welfare seriously? So when we're thinking about protecting welfare, this is the general framework that I like to think about for any kind of animal. When we're thinking about how to ensure they have good welfare, I call it the understand, measure, improve model. So the idea is the first step is that we understand what we mean when we're talking about welfare. So defining welfare, we measure the welfare of the animal, assess, you know, how well or poorly they're doing and under different conditions, and then we improve. So here we want to find out what the best conditions are for the welfare of the animal and implement them. And I'll be running through this in a bit more detail now, talking about sort of how this is normally done and what the challenges are for applying this model for insects. So to begin with, we have this question of what is welfare? And we want to think, before we do anything else, we need to understand what we mean by welfare, because the definition of welfare that we use is going to affect what sort of measures we use and also what we think count as welfare improvements. So here's two examples, for instance, of housing for a spider monkey. One of them is quite unnatural here. It's a cage with lots of logs and things hanging. And one of them's a big green island. Now, if you're someone who has a view of welfare that thinks that being natural is a very important part of welfare, you probably think that this island is actually the best kind of welfare for that animal, that that's the improvement you should want because it's green, it's got water. But if you're someone who thinks that welfare consists in making the animal feel happy and have these sort of positive affective states, you might actually think that this more complex exhibit, even though it sort of looks artificial, is actually going to be better for the monkey because it has more places to climb, where the island is very flat, because it's got all kinds of activities and things it can participate in. So the way that we define welfare is going to make a huge difference to what kind of recommendations that we make. Now, the most common theories or definitions of welfare for animals are these ones. So the first is subjective experiencing, whether welfare for the animal consists in their mental states or their feelings. There's physical functioning views that think about the health and fitness of the animal. There are natural living views, which think about how naturally the animal is living or how well it can perform its natural behaviors. And also preference-based views, which think about, do the animals have the things that they want? I think the best case for this is the subjective experiencing welfare concept. I'm not going to argue for that here, but I think this is increasingly commonly being adopted within animal welfare science as well. It ties very nicely to this idea of sentience we're thinking about. The reason we have moral concern for animals is they're capable of suffering. And so we might think that, yes, good welfare is having pleasure, bad welfare is having a lot of suffering. So then we think if we take this view of welfare as subjective welfare, then good welfare is going to be when an animal has mostly positive mental states, and poor welfare is going to be when it has mostly negative mental states. And then we can think about the quality of the experience of that animal over its lifetime. So we can think at one time it might be feeling good or bad, but also what's that balance looking like over its lifetime when it's got all these different positive and negative experiences over time, some of them very intense, some of them less intense. How are they going to add up to create a lifetime welfare of that animal? So we've got this idea of what we mean by welfare. The next step is then to go out and assess it. Because if we want to know how well animals are doing or whether something needs to change in the way that we are interacting with them, the way that we're housing them, we need to be measuring their welfare. So we need to be getting data on what's actually going on with them. So making the right decisions for the animals is going to require that we have knowledge of what their welfare is like under different conditions so that we know, what's good for them, what's bad for them. And this is really important because our intuitions on these kinds of things can be wrong. So I think some people think it's quite obvious. You can look at an animal and you can just think, well, yeah, it's not going to be good in this kind of situation. But research sometimes shows us that the things that we would intuitively think are better aren't necessarily the case. So this example here was sheep, but you can shear a sheep by hand by restraining it, or you can put it in one of these weird, industrial kind of metal things here and shear it like that. I think from a human point of view, it's quite natural to think that this machine shearing is going to be a lot worse for the animal, but it turns out actually that it's not. It's not worse for the welfare of the animal. The animals are actually calmer and less stressed when the machine is used. And this might be for something like the reason that this is a prey animal and being held and restrained by a human is more closely resembling being captured by a predator. But the point is that if we haven't investigated this, if people don't actually look at what the responses of the animals are measuring welfare indicators, we don't actually find out what it is that's best for the animals, and we might just be relying on these kind of faulty intuitions. So in order to go beyond our intuitions, we've got the field of animal welfare science. And welfare science uses indicators to measure the state of welfare in an animal and to look at how this welfare changes under different conditions. So the measures that we use that we think are tracking welfare are going to depend on our definition. Like I said, I think the subjective definition of welfare is the best one, but whichever one you take, you're going to need to make sure that the welfare indicators you use track that. And I just want to flag here, which is going to be a recurring theme throughout, that current welfare science is strongly vertebrate-centric. So I looked up the most recent review I could find of this was in 2014, where it was reviewing the papers published in animal welfare science, which journals they were published in, and what kind of taxa and situations they covered. The word insects didn't come up even once in that review, and invertebrates showed up almost not at all of any kind. So there's this strong vertebrate bias, and mostly mammals, within animal welfare science, which means that what we know about animal welfare and what we know about how to measure it is going to be, in many cases, not particularly applicable to the case of insects. And what's going to be needed is specialized welfare science and development of specialized indicators that can help track better for insects. So when we think about welfare science, what it uses is a range of different indicators, which are the methods that we use to gain information about the animal's welfare state. So how well or poorly it's doing at a given point in time. And these indicators will be physiological, so things like heart rate, blood cortisol levels, and they can also be behavioral, so presence of stereotypic behaviors, preference tests for if the animals are having what they want. All these kinds of things are asking this question of, is this animal happy or unhappy at this point in time or over time? So some of these can be cumulative indicators as well. And sometimes we have assessment frameworks. So instead of just using single indicators like this, you can combine multiple indicators into a welfare assessment framework. And that tells you something maybe more holistic about how the animal is doing on a number of different fronts. So some of the indicators we have for welfare might tell us about the animal's whole welfare state, but some of them might just tell us about one aspect of its welfare. So something like, is it healthy, or is it stressed, something like that. And we need to combine many of those together to get a sense of how well it's doing overall. And so here's an example of one of these frameworks, the welfare quality framework, that breaks down the indicators into these different principles. So good feeding, housing, health, and behavior. So it has different criteria set for each of those, and then a measure set for each of these different things. So then you've got this range of indicators that each just indicate one portion of the welfare experience of the animal. They are all brought together to get a sense of what the total experience is for the animal. The risk, of course, with these kinds of things is that if your list is incomplete, you may get a very wrong idea about how well or poorly the animal's doing. So just imagine you had this list of 12 criteria here, but the absence of prolonged thirst was missed off it for some reason. You could imagine then that, on a hot day where the animals don't have water, you think, yeah, but it meets the remaining 11 criteria really well, it must be doing well. But actually the animals will do very, very poorly because of their thirst experience. So having a complete set here is really, really crucial. And there are also questions about how you weight them against one another. It's a lot more difficult than it may first appear to think about how important is the health of an animal to its welfare versus the lack of hunger. How important is having some sort of behavioral opportunity versus not having a disease. And this is almost certainly going to be different for different species. So even though these kinds of frameworks can be applied to lots of different species. The specifics of them are going to change a lot. And again, I think that's going to be particularly true if we're thinking about something like insects that are just so vastly different from most of the vertebrate animals that we're used to working with in these frameworks. So when we're thinking about how we choose a measure to look at the welfare of an animal, what we're thinking about is picking the measures that best relate to the particular goal or context. So sometimes we want to assess the overall welfare of the animal. So we want to ask the question, how well is that animal doing right now? You know, on a scale of 1 to 100, is its welfare very bad or very good? And there are some indicators that are better for answering these questions. There may be, sometimes we just want to look at which areas to change. So we might be asking questions about, you know, what is it in this animal's life that is the biggest cause of its current suffering? And then just measuring the animal's welfare won't be good enough, because we can say, well, the animal has a welfare score of 40, say. But if we don't know why, if we haven't looked at its environment, we're not going to get a good sense of what it is we need to change. And so some sorts of measures, I didn't put this in here, but we can have some measures that are based on the animal themselves and some measures that are based in the environment. So, you know, if we want to see if an animal's hungry, you know, we can look at whether there is enough food in the environment. So environmental measures might be the presence of food, the presence of sufficient number of feeders, these kinds of things. Or it could be looking at the animal themselves to say, you know, are they showing feeding behaviors? Do they have certain levels of hunger hormones? These kinds of things. And so when we're thinking about having these environmental and animal-based indicators, they can help us tell us about what the areas are that we need to change. And I mean, a lot of the time as well, welfare science is actually just looking for the impact of a specific condition. So it's just saying, is this animal better or worse off if we change its food type from A to B? You know, is a chicken better or worse off if we put it on a flat floor versus if we give it perches? And so there, the kinds of indicators that you're looking for don't really need to tell us anything about how well off the animal is overall, just whether it's better or worse than it was before. And so different types of indicators are going to help us answer these different questions. Now, how does this all apply to insects? I've suggested some of this throughout. At the moment, where insect welfare or something like it is measured or discussed at all, the kinds of measures that are used are ones that don't necessarily really track very well the welfare of the animals. So one thing that's commonly discussed is mortality rate. So we take a group of insects and you say, well, how good or poor is their welfare? When we look at what percentage of them are dying at a certain life stage or before they reach, you know, whatever it is, the purpose that we need for them. And the idea is that, you know, if the mortality rate is high, that indicates that the welfare is very bad for the animals. If the mortality rate is lower, it indicates their welfare is better. I think this is a highly imperfect measure. The first thing is that there are potentially a lot of sublethal welfare harms. So there may be things that make the animals suffer, particularly if we think of suffering in this kind of, you know, mental states way that make them feel bad, that they might be frustrated, they might be feeling hungry or scared, any of these things that want to kill them, but certainly decreases their welfare a lot. So we don't want to think that just because the animals aren't dying means that they're having good lives. So I think what we need to think about here is what the actual correlations are for mortality with welfare. Some researchers say that insects are actually much less tolerant of bad conditions than vertebrates are, so they die quicker, which means that poor welfare does correlate better with mortality for insects than it does for other kinds of animals. This may or may not be true, but unless we have some other kind of welfare measure that we can use, it's difficult to correlate this. And so mortality rate is very, I guess it's good as a production measure. It tells us, well, look, you're doing something wrong. If you're trying to farm these insects, you don't want them to die. But if you want the insects to be feeling good, it's not at all clear that mortality is going to do enough. Insects that are dying are almost certainly feeling bad beforehand, but insects that are surviving may not be feeling good. And other kinds of welfare measures that are used typically are just productivity measures. So they might be looking at, you know, their rate of growth and thinking, well, if the animals are growing well, that means that they're healthy, free from diseases and injuries, these sorts of things. If they're reproducing well, same sorts of things. This has also been done in vertebrate work, but the problems with this are sort of the same. Just because an animal is growing and reproducing doesn't mean that it's happy. It's entirely possible that an animal's doing these things because they're very, very strong biological drives without actually feeling good. And so it's really important not to use measures like this, or to use them very, very cautiously, but to think about validating them. So when we're thinking about welfare assessment for insects, there aren't any indicators that are developed right now specifically for insects. So there are just these sort of things that are co-opted from other areas. And the existing indicators used in animal welfare science are based on vertebrates, mostly mammals. And so if we think about insects having this large range of physiological and behavioral differences from those kinds of animals, it may mean that those aren't going to be valid measures of welfare in insects. So, as some examples here, insects are going to have different stress physiology. So a lot of the welfare indicators that are used in vertebrates actually are stress indicators. So taking stress to be a proxy for welfare, which is, again, an imperfect one because there may be lots of different mental states that are good or bad for animals without being directly related to stress. But even if we do think stress is a good proxy, it's not going to look the same in insects as it looks in vertebrates. Brain anatomy, so some of the new welfare indicators for mammals, for instance, are looking at the volume of the hippocampus and the neural generation in that area of the brain. Obviously, insects don't have a hippocampus. It's not at all clear whether the similar or the sort of analogous areas in the brain for insects are going to have the same sorts of effects. The behavioral responses, one commonly used behavioral welfare measure in vertebrates animals is called qualitative behavioral assessment, where essentially an observer watches the animal move around and interact in their environment. And based on their kind of almost intuitive judgment of that animal's body posture, its style of interaction, they're sort of incorporating all these little bits of information about the way the animal moves around, and they can output actually quite a reliable and valid description of the welfare of that animal. That seems to work quite well. It's been well validated and it's shown to be quite reliable for a range of different vertebrate species, even recently doing fairly well for fish. Again, not very clear that that's going to be a reliable sort of measure for insects, maybe just because of our own familiarity as humans with insect behavior is going to be very, very different, but also perhaps our instinctive view of that behavior, it's just going to be too different from our own. If we're watching a mammal move around, it's got enough similarities to a human that we can read its behavior in a way that we may not be able to for insects. And so what this means is that we need to work quite hard on either developing new measures or at least validating existing measures for use with insects. So when we're thinking about validating measures, that's the process by which we figure out that the indicator that we're using is actually tracking the state that we're interested in tracking. So in this case, welfare. We want to say, is this indicator actually increasing when welfare is increasing? Is it decreasing when welfare is decreasing? Is it sensitive to changes in welfare? Is it insensitive to changes in other states of the animal that aren't welfare? And this is a really difficult process to get started on, because when you validate an indicator, usually you either need access to the state that you're measuring. So, say we take an indicator and want to say, is it a good measure of welfare? So say mortality that we're talking about before. If we don't have a welfare measure, how is it that we can tell if mortality is a good way of judging whether welfare is high or low? Because we need to independently know whether welfare is high or low first in order to get this idea about whether mortality rate is correlating with it. And so this is a difficult problem. It requires something like a bootstrapping where you use a number of different potential indicators and look for their relationships with each other, do some sort of interventionist experiments based on our background assumptions about what's going to be good or bad for insects and look whether they match those assumptions, and then they can be validated across with each other. Once you've got one decent welfare indicator, you can then validate others against it, but it can be a difficult process to get started with, and one that we need to be taking seriously, particularly for insects, because we just don't have these well-validated indicators at the moment. So then the next stage, after we've done this, we've understood what we meant by welfare, we've tried to find some validated indicators of welfare for the animal. Then what we need to do is find out what the best conditions are for the animal's living environment. And so here I'll talk a bit about that process, how we find out in general what the best conditions are for an animal, and again, why there are particular challenges for doing so with insects. So when I'm talking about welfare conditions, we're thinking about the things that affect the welfare of animals, so that they make the lives of these animals go better or worse. And these can be different sort of physical and psychological conditions that the animal experiences. So the presence of food, for instance, presence of shelter, companionship and social interactions, behavioral enrichments and play, all these different things. And so when we're thinking about what the conditions are for welfare, we're thinking, for any different animal, for any different species, what are its requirements in these different areas? So when we want to do this kind of process, the first step is to think about the natural history of the animal. So that is, think about what's its biology like in the wild. What kind of food sources does it eat? What social structures does it have? What kind of shelter does it take? What sort of behaviors does it perform in the wild? So I talked a bit before about this idea of natural behavior as perhaps not being the right way to think about welfare, but it can still be very closely tied to welfare, because natural behaviors very often for animals, the performance of their natural behaviors feels good, whereas frustration of those behaviors can feel bad. And so if we think that welfare, consists in trying to make animals feel better and take away their suffering, thinking about what behaviors they perform in the wild can be a really important way of thinking what's likely to give this kind of feelings of satisfaction or frustration for them when they're kept in captivity. You can also think about what kind of temperature ranges they're usually exposed to, what kind of humidity conditions. All these kinds of things can give you an idea. Again, it's not going to be perfect. We don't necessarily want to exactly mimic wild conditions. There's a lot of work on the moment talking about whether or not wild animals actually have good welfare at all. It may be the case that lots of wild animals experience lots of different suffering. That seems fairly plausible, given the challenges that animals experience in the wild. Food can be difficult to find. They can be exposed to different elements, diseases, predators, all these sorts of things. So we don't want to think that the natural history of the animal and the way it lives in the wild is going to be a perfect blueprint for good welfare, but it's certainly a starting point. So it's our basis for then going on and conducting experiments to see what is good or bad for the animal. So here we're thinking about using experimental methods, preference testing, or just measuring the welfare under different conditions to get a sense of what is good or bad for the animal. So for instance, you might take the animal, take two different kinds of shelters, look at if it's in shelter A, how good is its welfare? If it's in shelter B, how good is its welfare? And base both of those shelter types on what seems to be something that's natural for the species in the wild. And you can get a sense then of what's better or worse. Repeat this enough times with enough different conditions, and you start getting a good sense about what it is that these animals really thrive with. And preference tests can help tell you what they want. I'll talk about them in a second. And there's also the use of established welfare frameworks, and I will go on and talk about those too. So things like the 5 freedoms and 5 domains, which just list a number of sort of common, conditions and needs that animals have for their welfare. So, like I said, really important to think about the species biology, thinking about the species-specific needs and interests. So these are non-insect examples, just because these are ones that I'm more familiar with from working in zoos, but things like, knowing that alligators and crocodiles really like water, gives them these kinds of enrichments that use flowing water, which they really enjoy. Serval cats hunt by jumping in the wild, so enrichments that force them to jump for their food can be rewarding for them. Some types of birds will use tools or solve quite complex problems to get their food in the wild, again, providing these kinds of things in captivity. So knowing what the species-specific needs and interests are really important. And then, like I said, there are these methods like experimental and preference testing. So preference testing essentially gives animals choices between different conditions and looks at which they prefer. Will they choose to spend their time in box A or box B, where both of these boxes give them different conditions? And motivation testing, which attaches to this, looks at how hard will that animal work to gain access to those conditions. So here's a silver fox example. It has to pull this weighted string here. So that's working. How many times will it pull the string to go and see a social companion? Say 5 times, but it'll do it 16 times to get food. So we can say, well, look, to this animal, having its food is way more important than a social companion. And you can start getting a sort of a ranking and ordering of the different needs of the animals there. And at least in theory, these are the kinds of tests that could be performed very well with insects. Insects can make choices. They can work for different things, either by pushing through weighted doors, going through an uncomfortable area in order to gain access to something they want. So these are really very real methods that you can use to start getting a sense of what conditions are good or bad for them from their point of view. What is it that they want? Where do they go? What choices do they make when they are given the choice? And then finally, like I said, there are these welfare frameworks that try to think about what are the different components of the welfare experience for the animal and how can we make sure it's got all of these. So the 5 freedoms that's used for a very long time broke this down into freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom from discomfort, freedom from fear and distress, and freedom to perform natural behaviors. Now, there are questions and criticisms about whether this is a complete list of all the things that makes life good for an animal, I think there are additional questions about whether this is going to be appropriate for insects, but something like this, and thinking about these different kinds of needs, is certainly something that can be helpful. And more recently, the 5 domains model, which is built on a similar kind of framework but tried to update it, is something that's becoming more and more common for use, particularly within zoos, which is my background. This idea of breaking down welfare into 5 domains is something that's very common. And so here there's 4 physical domains, which are nutrition, environment, health, and behavior. And then all of these feed into the mental domain. So the idea is that all the opportunities or all the deprivations that the animals have in the 4 physical domains will give it mental experiences of different kinds. So deprivation of food will give it the feeling of hunger. Presence of disease will give it feelings of nausea or weakness. Behavioral restrictions will give it feelings of frustration, but behavioral expression may give it feelings of pleasure or joy. So the idea is here that for every single one of the needs of the animal, you're trying to translate it into this affective experience, mental experience it has, and then those are what comprises the welfare status. But this obviously raises some questions about what types of affects the animals are capable of having. So what type of things can an animal feel? Because almost certainly different animals are going to have these different sets of feelings, and they're going to experience them to different degrees. So, humans have a wide and quite complex set of affective experiences or emotions. Other animals might have much more simple ones. Maybe we think a caterpillar can only experience basic hunger and thirst. Maybe an earthworm can experience only pressure sensations. Complex aesthetic pleasures, I put a wombat there just because some sort of almost certainly untrue, but received wisdom in zoos is that wombats enjoy watching the sunrise and the sunset. They'll get up high on walks like this and look around when they do it. It's probably not a complex aesthetic pleasure in the same way that we view the sunrise and sunset, but perhaps it is. And the idea is here that animals have different sets of feelings, and we need to think about what they can feel and how important these feelings are to them, how they weight them against other things. So the important thing here is we want to avoid this kind of vertebrate centrism. We don't want to think that, any other animals, and especially invertebrates, feel things the same way we do or have the same priorities. I mean, one really basic example is obviously the endotherm-ectotherm distinction. So, for ourselves, we don't necessarily think about thermal comfort as being very high on the spectrum of welfare impacts, whereas we think food deprivation as being very, very high because food is our main source of energy. But for ectotherms, actually, thermal comfort is very, very important because that is their main source of energy. And so for a lot of, say, reptiles, for instance, access to food is much, much less important than access to sources of heat. So this idea that, the different affects, for a reptile, the feeling of hunger is probably just something very, very different than what it is to us. But the feeling of being thermally uncomfortable in some way is going to also prioritize differently. So when we've got these lists of needs, we really need to think about what matters to that species, given the things that it can feel. So what we can think about doing perhaps is building these kind of affect profiles where we think about what are the range of experiences these animals have and how do they weight them. Now, the picture I've got here was an example one. I couldn't find an affect profile that had really basic stuff. So obviously, I don't think insects feel contempt, but it's just sort of the idea that if you could measure these different things and how strong they are in any animal, including insects, that can help us decide what their experience is like and what's likely to be good for them. And so when we're building something like this 5 domains model, we can build it on the range of things that are going to be important to the insects based on the dominant affects that they're going to be feeling. So an example here, thinking about black soldier flies, which are very, very commonly used in farming now. We might think the affect profiles of the juvenile and adult stages are going to be very, very different based on the different needs of these groups. So, being a growth stage and being a reproductive stage, having just very different morphological characteristics, different physiologies. Might think that, the role of hunger, the role of thermal needs, the role of humidity needs, all these things are going to be felt differently. And one of the things that we want to do is think about how to construct these kinds of affect profiles to know what matters to those animals. And now here, just some quick sort of examples of the kinds of things that you want to think about. So if we're going out and wanting to test what matters to these animals, what kinds of questions should we be asking? Here's a range of the kinds of things that might matter. In the nutrition domain, the basic stuff is, yes, they need to have enough food and water. That food needs to meet their nutritional needs. But we also want to think, are they feeling satiated? Are they getting the sense of their bellies feeling full. So a lot of animals, for instance, can be fed on pelleted diets, which meet all their nutritional needs quite quickly, but don't fill up their stomachs and can leave them feeling hungry and uncomfortable all the time. There also might be pleasures coming from eating favorite foods, these sort of gastronomic pleasures that animals may experience that could contribute positively to their welfare. In environments, thinking about appropriate furnishings and shelter, temperature and humidity ranges. What is their perceptual environment? So this is, what do they see? What do they hear? What vibrations do they sense? Different animals have different sensory capacities, again, that we don't have. We don't have a strong olfactory sense. So we may not be knowing when the olfactory environment for an insect is really, really unpleasant for it to be in. And so these are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about when we're asking questions about what environments are good or bad for them. Another thing in the environment might be just having a large amount of variety, so the animal has choice and control over where it goes. Physical health, so the absence of disease and injury, but also perhaps physical fitness, the pleasures of moving around. I put here also, humane slaughter methods, huge issue for insects as well, something that we don't know very much about right now. Anesthesia, analgesia, slaughter in insects, big research areas that need to be covered. Behavioural opportunities, so what are the social behaviours that these animals want to participate in? What are the social behaviours they want to avoid? So stocking densities can be very, very high in insect farming. Is that aversive to insects? Do they not mind? Can they perform their natural foraging behaviours? Do they perform self-maintenance behaviours like grooming? And perhaps even play behaviours, as we've seen. Bees can play with things. Most recently, studies come out showing that bees will actually play with little balls. They will choose to do so apparently for no other reason other than it's fun. And so thinking about objects that animals can interact with in their environment just for the sake of pleasure is also a nice way of thinking about improving welfare. And when we think about all these different conditions that are good or bad for the welfare of animals, typically the ideal is to bring together husbandry guidelines and codes of practice. So thinking about different species, we've got here just a government code of practice. In zoos in particular, very, very common to have these husbandry and care manuals for every species, which is meticulously details all their different requirements, all their different desires. These are based on lots and lots of research because it's really difficult to find out all these things for animals. Some of it's just based on guesses, but what you want is you want to test all these things and find out, how much does having a pond matter to them? How much does high humidity or low humidity matter to them? Which things are really going to impact on their welfare? And basically for insects, these kinds of things don't really exist right now. Where they do exist, they're based mostly just on the natural history of the animal without any extra assessment about the welfare impact. I've put here the Insect Welfare Research Society has recently put out guidelines for protecting and promoting insect welfare in research. These are very, very general. So right now, because there isn't this kind of research about the specific needs of the different species, and particularly, what their needs are in relation to their welfare, what makes them feel good or bad, we can kind of gesture at the sorts of things, but more research is needed to figure out exactly what these are. So when we think about improving welfare, we go through these stages. We want to identify what's lacking in their housing and husbandry and implement any changes. Problem for insects requires knowledge of the natural history and the species needs. We might have a decent knowledge of the species natural history of a lot of insect species, but not their welfare needs. We then use welfare measurement to assess whether our improvements are effective. That requires validated welfare indicators, which we don't have. And we always want to be keeping in mind how the animal feels with its changes, which requires some understanding of the species' affect profile. What kinds of things is it capable of feeling? So to sum up then, how do we find out what is best for insects? We measure their welfare. Problem is our lack of welfare assessment tools. We provide the best conditions for the welfare of the animals based on their needs, but we have a lack of understanding of what insects need for their good welfare. And so what's really crucial, and I guess the big upshot of everything I've been saying today, is that we need to conduct research to remedy this. We need to know about how we measure insect welfare and what kinds of things they need. So developing and validating welfare indicators and assessment tools for insects, very, very high priority, and just research into the housing and husbandry needs and the welfare impacts of different housing and husbandry conditions for the most commonly housed species. And here a little plug, the IWRS has launched research grants for students to basically answer some of these questions about what kinds of things the animals can feel, what kinds of things are good or bad for them, to try and promote this kind of research to answer some of these questions and fill these evidence gaps. And some of the specific areas of concern, obviously farming, like I was saying, very large number of animals used, but also animals used in research, animals targeted by pest control. Understanding the welfare impacts of all of these things are going to be important. So in summary, insects are probably sentient and their welfare matters. It's something we should be taking really seriously, but we currently lack good methods of assessing insect welfare, and we lack knowledge of what conditions are best for their welfare. So essentially, more research in this is urgently needed, but I think that we're seeing this as an emerging research field now. So I hope this isn't taken too pessimistically, but more, encouragement for people to continue asking these questions and move into these sorts of research fields. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Heather. I would like to remind everyone, I forgot myself to mention this before your talk, we are open for questions. So if anyone has anything they would like to ask Heather, please type it into, not that, oh, there we go, we've already got one. So Heather, what do you think the precautionary principle requires us to do in working with insects as researchers?
Yeah, good. So I mean, essentially what I think the precautionary principle would require at the moment is to probably treat those insects as you would treat an animal of known sentience when you're working with them as a researcher. So there are fairly good guidelines in place for the way that we use, say, vertebrate animals, rats and mice, protection of their welfare in different kinds of ways. The 3 R's principles, use of ethical review committees for work that uses insects. And so I think implementing essentially these same kinds of strategies when working with insects in research, thinking about the numbers that you're using, can you use replacement models? Can you use a different number of insects? Is the method that you're using to conduct the research causing unnecessary suffering for the animal? Is there an analgesic or anesthetic that you can use? Is there a humane slaughter method being used at the end of the research? And how are these animals being housed and cared for when they're not being used? So what kind of conditions are they living in within the laboratory there? And what sort of things can you do perhaps to make those living conditions better for them as well?
Thank you, Heather. Do you have any publications addressing insects specifically that you'd recommend for further reading, either by you or by others?
Yeah, so there's nothing specifically by me right now. This is something, I guess, the work that I'm presenting today is something that I'm hoping to write up. There's some work that Megan Barrett, who runs the IWRS, has worked on, some publications she's had recently. I'm fairly certain that there is on the IWRS page now a database of research into insect welfare and sentience. So my main suggestion would be to go there and have a look at that. Basically, so that you can see what there is that's been done. There's not a lot at the moment, essentially. So a few publications essentially calling for more attention and more research.
There's a review, I think last year or this year, by Gibbs as well, which is Gibbs.
Gibbons, yeah, that's right, actually. So that's a question on insect sentience, and so that was about whether insects are capable of feeling pain. Yeah, no, that's a good one, actually. So Matilda Gibbons and team, put together quite a comprehensive review of that.
That's quite a good place to start. Okay, we have, what about aggregate welfare? Should we treat some number of insects better than one known sentient vertebrate animal? So I guess it's like a sentience, a welfare trade-off question.
Yeah, I mean, this is an exceptionally difficult question. So the question of interspecific welfare comparisons is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. But in essence, yes, I mean, it's difficult to know what that N is, but given just the billions of insects that we use, that, the suffering of, 1 billion insects is almost certainly going to be worse than the suffering of one vertebrate animal if we sort of add all that together. And so thinking about what are the most impactful ways that we can make changes to reduce global suffering, it may be that, relatively small changes. So if we think, I think it's highly plausible that the needs of insects are going to be relatively cheap and easy to meet. So, trying to keep an elephant happy in captivity is really, really hard. It needs a lot of complex things. Trying to keep a mealworm happy, probably not that difficult. And so it may be the case that you just need to avoid some of the major sources of suffering, give it something nice to eat and somewhere comfortable to sit. And it may turn out that these are very easy things to do and very, very cost effective. And so for that reason, when we're thinking about aggregates, we might be able to help very, very large numbers of animals for quite a small amount of investment.
Cool. And what is your opinion on feeding other animals live insects as enrichment?
Interesting. I mean, and this is something, because it's something I've done a lot in the past. Absolutely, like as a zookeeper, it's very, very common, and it just didn't occur to me for a very, very long time not to. So, most zoos have prohibitions on feeding vertebrate animals out live, but not invertebrates. And so, yeah, I'd feed live crickets, live cockroaches, live mealworms, in order for animals to, go through the processes of hunting, chasing, all of that. I think now I would treat it the same way that I would treat vertebrates, in that, yes, in an ideal world, having those sort of capacities for the animal to chase and hunt and catch and process the food live is good for them. But from the point of view of the insect that we're using, it's not worth the risk. So I think being able to essentially kill the animals before they're fed out is going to be the best way of making sure that that's done humanely.
We do another question, but I'm going to answer this one myself. So apologies, Heather. Is there a good informal place to discuss ideas surrounding welfare with other invertebrate-focused scientists and keepers? Some sort of forum. Yes, there is. It's insectwelfare.com. I invite you to go to our website, the Insect Welfare Research Society, and you can join our listserv. And there is actually space there for Google Groups where you'd be able to sort of communicate more directly with other sort of more invertebrate-focused people who are also welfare-minded. We have another question. What about invertebrates kept together in a tank ecosystem? So I guess it's going back to the crowding idea, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the question might be something like, how do we consider their separate welfare? How do we consider their different welfare? And I think this is going to be complex, because when you're keeping multiple species together in some kind of space, what one species needs and what another needs are going to conflict with each other sometimes. So I think what you need to be keeping in mind then is the density. So trying to make sure that you're not having too high densities of any of those animals, and essentially making sure the ecosystem is very complex. So, I mean, that's going to be my answer to almost anything for any animal. Usually complex environments are better than simple environments, but particularly when you're thinking about invertebrates in an ecosystem where you might have different species with different needs, having this kind of very complex, varied environment that animals can make choices about what levels of humidity, what levels of light, what levels of temperature, when they're in and out of shelter, all these sorts of things, being able to shelter from one another, get away from each other, all of those are going to be really important.
So unlike you, I'm an entomologist and not a welfare scientist, ostensibly. So I've got a couple of questions because I think we've still got some time, which maybe they're a bit more general. But let's I'm thinking if I'm an entomologist, I'm a researcher, and I would like to say come up with or generate a species-specific sort of welfare plan. What would be your recommendations of where to start? So I've got this animal that I'm using in my lab. No one else is really using it because I'm doing some odd kind of research, but I would still like to generate a species-specific welfare plan. What would be my sort of place to begin? Yeah,
so the first place to begin would just be looking at the natural history of that species. So, what kinds of, where does it live? What's its ecology? What's its behavior like? What are its interactions like in the wild? What kind of environment does it live in? As much of that as you can get as possible is likely to be a decent guide for a welfare plan. So if you're thinking about what temperature range, what humidity range, how much light, what kind of shelter, all these sorts of things, hopefully you'll get at least some sense of that from the wild. So if we're thinking that you're in a position where you can't be experimenting to find out what's better or worse for your animals, then I think that's a really good starting point. Looking at what exists for any related species, which for insects is probably very little at the moment. Obviously for mammals, that's something we can do quite a lot. But thinking about, what are the basic needs, thinking about what you might know about the capacities of that animal. So if it's something you've worked with before, what were your observations of its behavior? What kinds of stimuli did it seem to respond to in positive or negative ways based on your best judgment of these things? And I guess when in doubt, from me at least, you're on the side of caution. So, less crowding rather than more crowding, more variety in its environment so that they can have choices of where to go. Use of anesthetics and analgesics where possible. I know for a lot of insects that's really difficult and we don't really have a good sense of what those are yet, but thinking about those kind of like pain management, thinking about the procedures that you're doing and what kinds of suffering they might be inflicting.
Let's see. And I guess maybe a bit more of a complicated question. So I'm interested, well, two things, I guess. I'm interested in what the downsides were in these in these other welfare concepts. So you were talking, you tend to be favoring this idea of subjective experience. So I wondered if you could talk, because I have a question about subjective experience as well, which is, how on earth do I go around measuring that in an insect? Like, assuming that they can feel contempt or jealousy, that's a very complicated question to answer. And I guess even vertebrates, which are much more, are presumably having much more similar subjective experiences as us. Like I wonder whether it is like the subjective experience is a big benefit, or there are downsides to the other concepts, and how would I go about looking at that in an insect?
Yeah, good. So I mean, so the big benefit to me of the subjective experience concept is it just seems to track what we care about better than the other two. So my worry, or the other three, so my worry with the sort of the biological functioning is that, again, it's very functional, and I think it misses a lot of things. So, an animal can be healthy, but it can be scared, for instance, something like that. And so I think for that reason, the biological functioning is very rarely used. Natural living is probably something that comes up more commonly, but then we run into this problem that, a lot of things that happen naturally for an animal don't seem to be very good for it. It might be natural to be chased by a predator, probably not good for the animal. And so we come back to this idea of like, well, what's missing in those cases? And typically what's missing is, it's like, well, they're not telling us what the animal feels about it. This idea that animal suffering is what matters. And so I think, that's the very brief argument for why I think the subjective experiencing is the best thing. I mean, you're right that it's a difficult thing to get at. I talked about these affect profiles. In an ideal world, we'd get a sense of that. But even if we can't get that, even if we have no idea if an insect is feeling fear or shame, or, whenever these things are, what we can probably get a sense of is it feeling good or bad?
Right.
In the broad sense of the term. Like, I think what we do have a good sense of is positive and negative valence. Is the animal approaching or avoiding this thing? What are the signs that of general goodness? Like, is it stressed or is it relaxed? Like, these kinds of things. And so I think, even if we never got a sense of what kinds of feelings the animal had, I think the valence is something that's, at least in theory, easier to get at. And that's what really matters. I guess in the end, we don't care what it's feeling so much as we care is that overall feeling positive or negative.
We're unlikely to need insect counselors and insect therapists, but to sort of tease out these complex emotions. But okay, so yes, I guess we're stripping it down and taking it back to the very basics of like, okay, let's create I guess what was the phrase? It's a life worth living, and then let the insects work out the nuances for themselves.
Yeah, and in an ideal world, figuring out those nuances probably helps us do it better. But I think you can get a very rough and ready, and get a great deal of the way there just by looking at valence.
Cool. We've got a couple more questions from our attendees. What kind of regulations and accreditations would you like to see someday, say from organizations like the AZA?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the same kinds of regulations that you see for vertebrates is the rough answer. That I think, protections for sentient animals should be the same across the board. I think it's becoming clear that insects should be in that class. People can debate that. I think that they probably are. And so then you want regulations and accreditations that are the same. You need to be keeping the animals, hopefully building husbandry manuals for the animals, keeping them according to their natural history, ensuring there's choice and control. One big thing, if we're talking about sort of the zoo context, is that a lot of invertebrates housed are actually being bred for feeding other animals. And food animals, I mean, even rats and mice in zoos can be very overlooked. And so making sure that, complex housing and husbandry, that enrichment, all these things apply to animals being raised for food in the same way that they apply to animals being held on display as well.
And I think we've got time for just one more. Do you think that making experiments comparing natural behaviors in the wild and the lab could help?
Yes, I think they can help, but we have to be a little bit careful with what we infer from them. So I think looking at what behaviors are performed in the wild versus what are performed in the lab is a really good way of telling us what might be lacking in the environments of lab animals. Which behaviors are they missing? Which things are they not doing that they would otherwise do in the wild? And then we might make an inference that lacking those things is bad for them. But I say there's caution here because obviously they may not be performing the behavior of fleeing from a predator, but we're probably fine with that. So, based on some perhaps common sense and hopefully in the future welfare measurement, we can start thinking about, which of these natural behaviors are the ones that matter. But to start with, just looking for differences can still be really useful.
Wonderful. Okay, that unfortunately concludes our seminar today. So thank you all very much for attending. I will remind you again, we've got a our third seminar coming up in October. So be sure to register in good time. Lars Chitka will be talking about insect sentience, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much for your attention.